So one of the big myths that exists in the guitar playing community is about string gauges. Now there are a whole lot of videos about this last year, and I don't want to recap any of that. You know, Rhett Shaw and Rick Beato and a whole lot of other people did stuff about different string gauges and why actually the myth of heavier strings equals better tone is one that is something that kind of has been dispelled to a certain degree, and certainly heavier strings is a different tone. But one thing that I guess wasn't particularly well addressed was that surely if you have light strings and you're down tuning, you are asking for trouble. And there is a certain extent to why this is true. If you are a really heavy picker, say you're a metal rhythm guitarist or whatever, and you know you play in that kind of Hetfield style where you're playing from your forearm instead of your wrist, particularly, then yes, you may run into trouble because what happens is you pull, as you hit strings hard, you pull them sharp, and that can be an issue. No denying that, but for the most part, most of us, if you are a relatively light touch player, then there isn't necessarily anything wrong with having light strings and down tuning. Now, if I'm in standard tuning on my main Sir guitars, I'm using an 8.5 to 44 set, which is pretty light. It's not as light as some people, but for standard tuning, that gives me enough tension to be able to play in tune. I have tried going as low as 8s. To be honest, that's just a little bit floppy for me, and I find it a little bit difficult just to keep in tune on such a light string. But certainly, people who are playing in like 11 or 12 in standard tuning, which I've done and I can do. I did a gig a couple of years ago where, because the guitar that was available to me was one that I typically tuned into C standard or C sharp standard or something, it had 12 to 60 on, and that was hard work in standard tuning. But I can do it. It can be done. My acoustics have heavy strings on, so I'm used to playing that. But for me to be fully comfortable and for me to be me, I like relatively light gauge strings. Now, both the excerpts you heard at the start and the one you'll hear at the end are me playing on blue, and blue is tuned down a whole tone, so tuned to D, often to drop C, but for those particular examples, I was just tuned to straight D, and I'm running essentially a standard 9.5 to 44 set, except with a slightly heavier low string, and my reason for that again is to do with, particularly if I'm drop tuning, I want to have a little bit of extra tension in that low string, so it doesn't, if I hit it too hard, pull too sharp, and then it just makes things sound more in tune if you have a little bit of extra tension in that low string. But this whole myth of certain string gauges give you better tone is something that that I guess I've battled with over the years, because there is something quite cool about playing a guitar with heavy strings, and particularly if you are playing slide, then heavy strings are definitely a good thing. I'm not suggesting you should go down the Joey Landra 19 to 70 or whatever it is, but certainly a set of 12s might benefit you if you're playing slide in open E, and certainly if you're down in something like open D, then the set of 12s are useful for that. But for me, yes, this 9.5 to 44, except with typically a 48 if I'm playing in D standard on that low D string, and a 52 if I'm tuned down to C on that low string if I'm in drop C. That would be where I would go. Now, is there any kind of history behind people getting heavy tones with light strings? Of course. I mean, the most classic example is, of course, Tony Iommi, who obviously his reason for doing what he did was partly due to an accident he had just at the very start of his career, where he lost the tips of 2 of his fingers. So he used incredibly light strings. So he uses 9 to 42 in C sharp standard. So that's half a gauge lighter than I'm using and half a step lower still. And then for when he's in D sharp or E flat standard, He uses 8s to 32s, I believe. So that is almost unbelievably light, and yet gets some of the heaviest sounding tones you will ever hear out of that. So yeah, there is no, yeah, if anything flies in kind of the whole face of tradition of getting heavier tones from heavier strings, then I think that's it. But also someone like Yngwie Malmsteen, who plays 8s and low output pickups on Fender Strat single coils, gets some pretty heavy rocking tones. So I don't think that you need to worry too much about the string gauge you use for the style of music you play, or even for the tuning you use. Find something that's comfortable to you. For me, lighter gauge strings but with a slightly higher action is what works best for me in terms of getting that tone that I want. It may be that a set of 11s but really really low gives you, because of your playing style, the confidence to play how you play. Also bear in mind I'm working on a 25.5-inch scale length, so if I was on a 24 3/4 Gibson scale length, I would want heavier strings. My Les Pauls have 10 to 52s on, I think, so that's heavier still, and that's again a tuning thing, a personal preference thing, a tone thing, but for what I play the majority of the time, the lighter strings on the longer scale, it's what works for me. So I would encourage you to experiment, try out a few different gauges, try building your own custom gauges. Now for me, I have to buy a set of 9.5s and get a 48 string separately, so I've got a whole bag full of 44s kicking around that I will use on something at some point. In fact, I tend to use them on my 8.5s, but that's an even more complicated set to get an 8.5 to 44. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways, and certain companies, Stringjoy amongst others, you can get custom made sets. I think Kirk Mangan as well. I use D'Addario NYXLs, which is a little bit limiting in terms of what's available as custom sets, but you can get the individual strings, you just maybe pay a little bit more for it. So have a play around, see what works for you, but certainly in my experience, lighter strings does not equal lighter tone. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you found that interesting. Take care, and I'll see you next week.